All right, hello everyone again. Welcome back. So in this video, which is going to be in two parts, we're going to be looking at some foundational definitional issues for the course. So whether or not this is the course you're taking on ethics or this is the course you're taking on politics, at the heart of both, we have to start laying down some basic definitions of what it is that we could possibly be talking about, and then how we can organize all those definitions in relationship to each other. So what I'd like to do now, and I'm going to send out a handout associated with this very soon, is to provide what's called a map of theological ethics. Now, theological ethics, in its broadest possible sense, applies to a course on ethics and to a course on politics, insofar as we are looking at how to organize value, how to organize conceptions of good and bad and right and wrong, and how that may apply to also the concept of legality. So this is intended to sort of be the map that we're going to use as we move forward in trying to organize and understand the various concepts. So again, you'll have a handout that will go with this. But what I'd like to do is to start off just by thinking about sort of the most basic questions that we have with terms of good and bad and right and wrong, whether in the realm of politics or in the realm of morality. And of course, there's a lot of overlap there. So sort of the place we can begin is kind of with experience. And so to represent that, I'm going to draw a circle. And within this circle, we can think about all the kind of practical questions that we have, again, from a political perspective or from a moral perspective, questions about, well, how should I vote? Which particular candidate should I vote for? What kinds of positions should I take on various issues, on issues like abortion and issues like welfare and poverty and immigration and so on and so forth? Even more specific than that in terms of your own individual life, how should I live my life? What kind of people should I associate with? What kinds of career paths are morally legitimate and which are not? So within this circle, we can be asking those very particular questions that we can't not ask, and in some way or another have to answer, because we have to live our lives and we have to make decisions, right? And we're constantly at junctions where we can go this way, this way, this way, this way, and we have to make a decision. Also, not making a decision is a decision. So here, what we'll call this is we'll call this circle what's called applied ethics. Now, applied ethics, in its most basic sense, just means answering the particular questions that we have right here and right now, both as individuals and as communities and as states and as nations and so on and so forth. It's applied in the sense that you're trying to get an answer to something that you want to do right now. And so you need it, right? One of the things I want to immediately make clear is that oftentimes people think about ethics as a kind of, well, it's like when you go into a building and you see an axe on the wall or a hose on the wall, and it's usually behind glass, right? And it says break in case of emergency. And the idea there is, in case if there's a fire or if there's a natural disaster, and so all of a sudden you need access to these tools to help you survive, well, then break that glass. But of course, only break that glass in emergency. Well, a lot of people think that ethics is like that, or thinking about ethics is like that. It's like, well, I'm just living my life, doing what I do, sort of coasting along, and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, I have a crisis. I have to make a decision. And it could even be something as mundane but hard to think about as like, well, I think my best friend's girlfriend might be cheating on him, but I'm not sure. And what do I do? Do I say something or not say something? Do I do it sort of an informal investigation? Do I just pretend the whole thing's not going on? Well, that's its own form of an ethical crisis, right? So all of a sudden, oh, I have to start thinking about conceptions of good and bad and right and wrong and their implications. Well, of course, there are moments like that in life, and sometimes there are truly moral emergencies in terms of natural disasters or in terrorist attacks or things like that, where all of a sudden becomes really urgent that you think very carefully about how you're going to proceed. But of course, most of life is not like that. And so what I want to make clear from the very outset is that, again, this is part one of a video, there'll be more parts, is that ethics is actually everywhere all the time. Insofar as you're making any kind of decision whatsoever, again, whether it's in the political realm or in the personal realm, or the social realm, whatever it may be, you're deciding based upon some kind of conception of what's good, what's bad, what's right, and what's wrong. Even in the minutia of your life, including like, should I get out of bed this morning? Like, really? What if you're feeling down? You know, like, is today a day that I really want to get out of bed? Am I going to do it? Even decisions like that, you grab onto some conception of what you think is good and bad and right and wrong. So what applied ethics is getting at is that what we're doing is we're thinking about all the different decisions we have to make throughout the day, throughout our lives, both individually and socially. And of course, this is a huge area, right? Like an enormous area. We could spend all of our lives just thinking about these particularities. But the first point that I want to make is with regards to this circle in relationship to other, sort of in a hierarchical order, which we'll see what this looks like as we put it together, is that applied ethics depends upon a greater conceptual field of inquiry. Now, let me pause right here. I'm going to be drawing a map on this board of concentric circles, circles within circles within circles, and I'd like you to think about it in two ways at the same time. One is the 2D model. So what we're going to see here is, for example, that applied ethics is within ethics, but ethics is not in applied ethics in the same way. In other words, applied ethics depends upon ethics, but ethics does not depend upon applied ethics. So we're going to see a hierarchy of relationships of dependency as we move up, which I'll be explaining. At the same time, we can also begin to think of this, as I start putting these circles, to flip it on its side and to make a 3D model at it. So at the very top of this model, it's like you're looking down on it like that. The very top of this model, what you have is applied ethics at the very top. It's like the peak of this cylinder, this pyramid that we're going to be building. Now, to that model, you'll be able to apply gravity in this conceptual paradigm. And so anything beneath something is necessary for that which is above it, but that which is below doesn't need that which is above it in order to exist. So that's another way of thinking about the relationship of hierarchies that we're going to establish here. So if applied ethics addresses the question, how do I live, and this could be we live right here and now, that's the basic question that we're asking in applied ethics. Ethics is asking, what is good and bad and right and wrong? We could also put within the same category of ethics of how do I live a good life? How do I live a purposeful life? How do I live a life of meaning that corresponds with some conception of what is really good and really bad and really right and really wrong? It recognizes those categories and is able to navigate in and through them. Okay, so the first question to ask is, well, why is ethics a bigger conceptual category than applied ethics? Or to use that 3D model, why does ethics sit below applied ethics so that if we take out ethics, then applied ethics would collapse, would have no legs to stand on? Well, I hope it's apparent even from the terms that we're using that applied ethics depends upon ethics because you need something to apply, right? By definition, if you're applying something, you're presupposing that you have something to apply to the right here and the right now. So without ethics, there would be nothing to apply. Ethics itself, however, once we move down one rung or we move out one rung, is an enormously complex field. And we're gonna expand this map in just a moment, but getting at questions of good and bad and right and wrong, as I hope was clear from the first exercise that you did in the discussion pages, well, it's not easy, right? Once you begin thinking about the principles that you appeal to in order to say, well, I think this is good, and I think this is bad, and I think this is right, and I think this is wrong. Well, how do we identify those principles? How do we define the good in the most basic sense? How do we find evil in the most basic sense? And as we saw from the first lecture, it's not simply enough to say, well, there's no such thing as good and evil, because, okay, that's a potential answer, but that's also recognizing that there's some sort of conception that's true, right, with regards to good and evil and right and wrong. At least you think it's true if you take that position. So this is enormously complex, but we have to do it, right? We have to have some conception of the good and some conception of evil or wrong or that which is not good in order to be able to apply it. So you could say right now, you could say, well, why? Why do I have to begin thinking about this? I was required to take this course, and so I'm going to take it. But like, I'm okay living my life. I don't really need to enter into this abstract theoretical territory and able to figure out what I need to do. Certainly not why I get up in the morning. Well, maybe now, but maybe not later. Because again, once you have some sort of crisis in your life, once you have some kind of moment of decision where you have to go or this way, right? You have to have a principle above you, conceptually speaking, that you appeal to and say, because I believe this, therefore I'm going to do this. If you don't have that principle, here's what we all end up doing. And this is what haunts every single aspect of our lives, is the reality or the potential reality of sheer arbitrariness. Sheer arbitrariness. And what I mean by that is your decisions become, literally speaking, random and unintelligible. I mean, you can't actually give an account to yourself why it is you're doing what you're doing. And so you end up sort of just doing whatever. And you say, well, I can appeal to my feelings, and my feelings tell me what to do. But we talked about in the previous video, right? What happens when you have conflictual feelings, which is probably pretty frequent, if not all the time. What principle do you use to be able to identify, well, I'm going to follow these feelings rather than these feelings? So it's not something we can escape, this idea of thinking about ethics. Even in our own individual lives, we need a principle or a set of hierarchical principles that we appeal to in order to live our lives. That's individual, but of course that's also socially and in community and politically as well, right? We need something to apply in order to create the laws and the social norms that are going to govern a particular society. There's another thing important to recognize here, that whatever I'll use a different color, whatever we identify as our principles here, we'll create an inverted pyramid to represent this. We have to recognize that getting from the theory or the generality of what we identify as good and bad and right and wrong to the particular application always isn't clear and easy. It's something we have to think through carefully. So let me give you an example. Let's say that as you're thinking through, you think, okay, well, what's my most basic foundational value? It's going to be something like, you could say, something like the golden rule, some variation of the golden rule. Well, I'll say, I would only do to others what I would want done to me if I were in the same situation as that person. So you could say, my ethic, my conception of good and bad and right and wrong, its foundation, its most basic principle is the golden rule. Okay, that's certainly a good contender, right? We do find lots of variations of the golden rule in many different, not all, thought systems throughout the world. But here's the problem, right? How do we apply the golden rule to every single circumstance in our life? So think of this, for example. Let's say you're a police officer and your job, your duty is to protect the community, right? That's your job. But you're also convinced that we should all live by the golden rule. You think that's true. You think that's right. So let's say you're driving down Lincoln Avenue, right by LMU, and you see a car kind of swerving, and you pull over the car, right? And as you get out and begin to approach it, the window goes down and this huge plume of smoke comes out. And it's not cigarette smoke or vape smoke. It's marijuana, right? You smell marijuana. And as you peer in there, past all the smoke, you see that there's an open container of, vodka in the driver's seat. And the driver's eyes are all red and blurry. And they say, what's the problem, officer? Right? So I'm just trying to set this up an extreme example, but of course this does happen a lot. So you think to yourself, I'm in a situation in which I'm going to have to make some sort of action here. So what should I do? What should I do? Well, I'm a police officer. My job is to protect the community. And I believe that what I should do is what I would want done to me if I were in the exact same position of that person. So you think, well, what would I want if I happened to be a person who was both high and drunk driving a car? Well, I probably wouldn't want to go to jail, right? I probably wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want to be caught. Oh, okay, so given that I wouldn't want to be caught, and that's what I would want in that situation if I were inebriated and high and totally out of my senses, well, therefore, the right thing to do would be to just let that driver go, right? Well, like, of course not. Like, that's terrible. That's a terrible idea. It's a bad decision. I mean, you're legally liable at that point if you're a police officer and you let that person get back on the road. So you can already see that it's, getting from the golden rule to a particular decision is not always the best principle to use. Maybe instead of what people want done to them, maybe we have to appeal to some conception of what's just, independent of what people want. Like maybe we're going to have to do things against people's wishes in order to be good. So you see how complex it is, and we can think of lots of other ideas. Think of judges with people coming before them day after day after day, making their cases. Both sides want to win, but the judge has to say who's right, not who wants what, but who is right. So again, just because we're able to identify a general principle doesn't mean it's easy and obvious for how that general principle is applied. But at the same time, we have to have a general principle. So this is all pretty complex at this point, but it doesn't stop there. Why? Because in order to ask the question, what is good, bad, right, and wrong, in which then we apply of how do I apply that, how I live that, I have to actually ask a broader question, a more foundational question. I'm going to have to create another circle here that represents 3D, another layer lower, or 2D, a higher conceptual relationship, a relationship of dependency. So applied ethics depends upon ethics. Ethics is going to depend upon, we're going to call it epistemology. What is epistemology? Epistemology comes from the Greek word pistis, episteme, which is a form of systematic knowledge. Ology means study. So basically, it means the study of knowledge from a systematic perspective. Like, here's the question. How do we know what we know really? How can I actually be sure of what I know? Not just my impressions or what I sort of superficially think to be the case, but how do I really know? But let's pause and say, well, why at this point in this diagram, why would I need to answer this question? How do we know what we really know, or how do we know what we know really, in order to answer this question? What is good and bad and right and wrong? Well, I hope the question answers itself, right? Because in order to know what is good and bad and right and wrong, you have to have a sense of how you know what you know. And that doesn't only apply just to how you know what you know morally. It certainly applies to that. But how do you know anything at all? That's the study of epistemology. And even if we just scratch the surface there, we can see that epistemologically, figuring all this out is really, really complicated. So what are some potential options here? Well, we went through some. We went through empiricism in a previous video. It means your senses. We could also look at logic, understood as the rules that govern thoughts. We could also look at metaphysical forms of inquiry. We can call this rationality, which looks to identify, what potentially must necessarily be true in order for existence to be, and so on and so forth. These are some potential options for epistemology. And again, it's not easy and obvious for us to figure out what's right. So think about, for example, empiricism. We're at a time right now where one of the dominant cultural trends is that science can answer all of our questions. All of our questions, not just some of our questions, but all of our questions. So science is sort of the preeminent form of empiricism, understood as you examine empirical reality, and then you seek to look at cause-effects relationships and then change variables in order to see if the hypothesis that you have about this affecting this is actually the case. And so you test it against the standard of falsifiability, which means that, if I can show it doesn't happen once, then I have to look at a different hypothesis for why it is happening. Now, let's be clear here. Science is a very powerful tool. But the question, of course, is it the only tool, and does it give us access to the fullness of truth? Again, looking at this idea that maybe truth is impossible to avoid. So if we have to make some kind of truth claim. Well, we know, for example, that our senses deceive us all the time. And one of my favorite examples of this is that if you take out the human eye, you probably already know this, but it's pretty crazy when you think about it. If you take out the human eye, let's not be too morbid here. Let's make a perfect model of the human eye, and you stick it on a stick, right? And you put a projector on this side, and you project an image through it. Well, on the screen behind it, you know how the image would appear, right? It doesn't appear as if you just like put it through a lens or put it through a window and it's just going to appear on the other side. It actually would appear what? Upside down. In other words, when light bounces off matter and comes into our eyes, the level of the eye, the way that it's entering, it's actually flipped, it's inverted, which means what? Our brains are constantly fixing reality so that it looks upright. But what does that mean, strictly speaking? That means we're not seeing reality in and of as it is, or at least as it is purely through our eyes. We're seeing a generated image. In other words, we're all looking at each other through screens, as it were, just in terms of our sight. And again, maybe you already know this, but the more we look into our senses, the more we see that our senses are governed by rules, that we're not just getting raw reality coming in, we're getting reality that's coming in through senses which have rules embedded in them. So for example, if I do this on somebody's arm very slowly, I'm going to feel 3 different points, right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But experimentation has demonstrated that if you have a machine that's actually able to do that fast enough, where it starts going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and you increasingly speed it up, you know what you'll actually feel? You know what the sensation will be? Not 3 distinct points, but somebody doing this, making a straight line down your arm. So what you're experiencing, what you're sensing, is that someone's making a line, when in fact there are 3 different points. Why? Because our brains have rules embedded in them for how to interpret reality. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't interpret reality and can't have any kind of real sense of what's going on. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm recognizing that there are, of course, limits within empiricism, limits to our senses that to some degree perhaps we can overcome, but to other degree potentially we can't, because our senses are governed by those laws, and from a purely empirical perspective, we can't jump outside of our senses to use our senses, right? There's a kind of governing of it from within the constructs of our minds itself. Now, there are other forms of knowledge that aren't necessarily dependent upon the senses. Here I'm speaking strictly of empiricism. So again, we know that our senses deceive us all the time. We also know that, again, we're interpreting reality, right? You may think that you're seeing me right now, but think of all the technology that's between us in this whole medium where I'm speaking into this camera, and then that camera is generating an image, right? And then it's transporting that image, and you're watching this, not even in the same space, right? We're not in the same space, we're not in the same time, and yet you're still able to interpret me as somehow real. Well, even if we were in the same room, you'd be saying, well, there's that guy, there's Matt Petrusik, right? But is that really Matt Petrusik? Well, yeah, of course it is, but not really. I mean, that's my interpretation of that person, but I've already put on a social kind of construct. There's this thing called name, right? And I've already, and if I'm going to call him professor, there's this construct called the university. But even at you just break it down into the more particular level, I'm not actually here in the sense of being totally one unified body, what you're doing is you're perceiving a collection of atoms within which there's actually more space than mass. There's more space than matter when you get at the particle level of reality. So I'm actually more not here than here because of that space between atoms, space within atoms. But you still interpret it as a thing. So think of all of those layers of interpretation where you're making decisions about reality, either implicitly or explicitly, to create a reality. So again, this is not to say like we can't trust our senses at all or that science has no purpose or use. Absolutely not. It's to say we can't be so naive as to think that just we have this like raw experience coming in and it's just sort of we just sort of absorb it and it's obviously clear that the way in which we absorb it makes sense. So empiricism has its limits. One more thing about empiricism. When we apply empiricism to the question of morality, things get really complex. So perhaps you believe that all human beings are morally equal. Let's just say as a postulate that you believe that. So that independent of any differences that may adhere in between one human being and another, in terms of physical differences or differences in capacities, intelligence or beauty, or the ability to carry out a particular task. We might call it social usefulness. You say, well, no, it doesn't. None of that matters for somebody's intrinsic value. All human beings are equal across the world, throughout space and time. Okay, that's a. Some people don't believe that, but a lot of people do. And let's say it's a good thing to believe, potentially, right? But how do we justify it epistemologically? How do we say that I know that all human beings are actually equal, that I'm not just making that up? I'm not just purely asserting something like, well, all leprechauns love to go find gold at the end of the rainbow, and I assert that's a nonsensical, that's a silly thing to say, but it's a very true and good thing to say that all human beings have equal dignity. Okay, empirically, how do I justify it? Well, seriously, like how do you justify it? You can't just say it. You have to explain it, why it's true. Can you do it empirically? Can you use your senses to come to the conclusion that all human beings have equal value, independent of any characteristic that they have? Well, first of all, here's the first question. How do you perceive value empirically? Like, what does value look like, independent, just in and of itself, in terms of its impression on your senses? Is value something that's perceived sheerly empirically, or is it recognized? If it's recognized, that must mean that there's some sort of value structure that's already here somewhere that you're applying out into the world to point out things that are valuable. So it's pre-empirical in a sense if you're recognizing something. So what does value look like from a purely empirical perspective? Here's another thing. Where do you see human equality empirically speaking? Empirically speaking, where do you see it? Where does it exist? Where do you find absolute equality? Let's assume you can see value, which is really hard to come to that conclusion, but for the sake of argument, let's say we can just see value purely. Where do you see it? In what way do you see it that it's absolutely equal? Why? Why is that an important question? Because if we're doing an empirical study of humanity, any characteristic we identify, whether it's self-awareness or it's IQ or it's physical strength or its capacity for thought or its emotions or whatever thing you want to point to, if you look at it empirically, what are you going to find? And this is pretty interesting in and of itself. But basically, you're going to find what is this? It's a bell curve. So you're going to find that of the population that you're studying, and we can just imagine the whole human population here as just a postulate, some people will have very little of it. Some people will have a lot of it. And then most people will fall into that wide, generous center of whatever characteristic it is. This is true not only of individuals in a population, but it's true of our own lives in terms of any capacity that we have. So at some point, our physical strength peaks. At some point, our intelligence and our capacity to reason peaks and then begins to degrade. So where's the equality? Where do we point to it? This is really important because there's all these ideas here that we can just sort of discard entire areas of thought by saying that's silly, superstitious nonsense. While at the same time, people come in and say, but oh, obviously, in case all human beings are equal. Well, how do we know that if we're just relying on empiricism? Now, that doesn't mean that we can't come up with an argument that all human beings are morally equal. It just means there's a limit to empiricism. So, empiricism is one form of potentially answering how do we know what we know, but is it the only form? There's also logic and metaphysical rationality, which we'll be getting into in different ways as we move on in the course. But let me give you just one example. Think of the number 0. Think of it. Think 0. And I don't mean like think of a circle in your brain. Think of the concept 0. What does it literally mean? Absolute 0. Not relative 0. So like right now I have no dollars. I have $0 in my pocket is usually the case. But there are dollars to be had, to be put in my pocket out there. I mean absolute 0, like no thing, nothing at all. So think nothing. Well, in and of itself, thinking nothing means you're thinking something insofar as you have to have some content 0, but the content you give is the absence of something, so absolute nothing. Can you observe that? You should go out, give you an assignment, to go out into wherever you are right now. It's like look for a 0. Try and capture a picture of one in the wild, like walking around and you catching it. You can't, right? I mean, but by definition, you can't. Because by definition, 0 is the absence of all things. So does that therefore mean that 0 is a nonsensical concept? That it's silly to talk like you should be embarrassed? And there's this great math conspiracy that's been imposed on all of us? That there's this thing called 0? Well, no. Our minds appear to have the capacity to identify things as in some sense true that are impossible to identify in the empirical world. In fact, maybe that there's some sort of logic that's sort of pre-packaged within us in some way that makes even empiricism possible in terms of sense experience coming in and making sense. So logic and then metaphysical rationality or just rationality more generally would be things that must be true in order for anything else to be true, is getting this idea that maybe there's some ideas that we must necessarily have access to in order to have access to any other idea. If some of you have ever studied Platonism, this also has some Platonistic insights, which also exist in the Christian tradition as well. We'll get to all that, but here's the point I want to leave you with before I go to the next rung. We have to answer these questions. Whatever particular answers we come to, we have to have a good sense of why we know what we know. Why? Because if I can't say how I know what I know really, first and foremost to myself, if I can't explain that, well, then I can't say what's good and bad and right and wrong. I can't tell myself with any confidence whatsoever why this is good and why that's bad. And if I can't do that, well, then I can't make an action. I can't do something with any sort of intelligibility to it. Again, first and foremost to myself, and of course to other people as well. So we need to do epistemology in order to do ethics, and we need to do ethics in order to do applied ethics. But it doesn't stop there. In order to ask and answer the question, how do I know what I know? I have to ask and answer a more basic question, more basic in the sense of it's more conceptually basic, of what we'll call anthropology. Now, anthropology is, as you probably know, is basically the study of what it is to be a human being, of what defines humanity qua humanity in its totality. Now, within anthropology, there's different divisions, but the most basic question is what's the study of humanity qua humanity? So, what is a human, basically, and what are human beings, also plural, us in a community? So the first question asks is, well, why is this more basic? Again, thinking of it in the 3D model, why is asking and answering the question of what is a human being below the question, how do we know what we know, which is below the question, what is good and bad, right and wrong, which is below applied ethics. Well, put it most basically, there must first exist a human being in order for there to be what? Human knowledge. If there's no such thing as a human being, if we come along and say, well, humans actually don't really exist, well, then the question of what a human being can know is, well, it's mute, right? Moot, sorry, not mute, moot. It's absolutely moot. There's no reason to ask it because it's already been dissolved by a previous claim. So we need to have a definition of what a human is as a human in some way in order even to begin to ask what a human being can know. That's point one. Point two is a lot hinges on the definition of the particular definition that we come up with. So one thing that that we can define human beings as, one way we could define human beings in relationship to, you know what, I'll do it on this board over here. One fundamental decision we have to make, for example, especially when we're looking at humanity writ large in relationship to all that is let's have a, I don't know, this will be a picture of a single cell organism floating around in the water. And here's a human being up here. So one question to ask, maybe algae, I don't know if it's algae, single cell, something really simple floating around in the ocean. Okay. So one question to ask is the difference between this single cell organism and a human being, is it just like a difference of degree where you just get higher and higher and higher? So here you get kind of like a, I'm going to really embarrass myself how poorly I draw. Here you get like a fish, and then you get, I don't know, you get some sort of like a chicken, and then eventually you get a dolphin. I'm going to embarrass myself. This is supposed to be a dolphin, and then you get an elephant. I'm not going to try to draw an elephant, but you get sort of higher and higher levels of cognitive ability. You get into the primate territory, and eventually there you just kind of like keep turning up the capacities little by little, and there you get into a human being. So is that the right understanding of reality? Or in terms of human reality, is that the right definition? Or do we recognize that there's some relationship with life, with all life? There must be. We're all in the same boat, as it were, in terms of we're all related somehow. We're all on the same planet at the very least. Do we recognize a kind of gradation upwards, but then some fundamental break where, yes, human beings are related in terms of our nature to nature and to animal nature in different forms, and at the same time, there's some fundamental difference that makes us human and different than everything else. Well, that's a question we have to answer. One way of putting it, and using theological language, which we're going to do a lot in this class because of its title, is to say, do human beings have a soul or not? Well, that's an anthropological question. Is there something that exists in the human being that is real but not material and not reducible to matter? Well, that's it, that we have to ask and answer that question. And how we ask and answer that question determines a lot of the output here, what we're actually going to come up with on the other side. Why? Because if I say model of one, and what it is there's just human beings just kind of, you just turn up the capacity volume, and eventually you get into a human being, which there are people who believe this. Peter Singer, a famous philosopher, believes it, for example. Well, then what can we really know? Well, one thing that we're not going to be able to know, if that's true, I'm not saying it is, but if that's true, is that we're not going to be able to know transcendent truths or some kind of universal rule or universal goodness that sort of encompasses us all. No, we're just going to be like animals, and we're going to be identifying things in the world and manipulating our natural environment to get what we want. So that would really season our definition of epistemology. On the other hand, if we believe that there is a kind of break between animal life and between human life in its totality, well, then maybe we can have an epistemology that can identify universal truths and maybe even transcendent truths, maybe even moral truths that are true no matter what and can't not be true and things like that. So you see how much it matters in terms of defining your anthropology. One more thing to keep in mind here is when we're asking about the human and we're asking about how we think about means and we think about ends. And one question to ask is, given our status as biological beings, are we just creatures that think about means, or do we also think about ends? So let me give you this example. Animals constantly make choices, and they always make choices in terms of how they're going to navigate their natural environment. And you see this even, you see at the insect level, even below that. One of my my guilty pleasures is I like watching nature documentaries. Everybody else is asleep, I'll put on a nature documentary. And one of the things that blows me away is how smart even the most basic forms of life can be. So, for example, you look at like a spider that's hunting, and it's setting a trap, meaning it has to be able to think in some sense about different possibilities for its prey, of what its prey might be doing, and then plan accordingly for those possibilities in order to get its prey. And so, it lays a piece of web over here, a piece of web over here, a piece of web over here, and trying to calculate the best way to get the food that it wants to eat. Well, that's very complex thinking about means, right? But is it thinking about ends? That's a different form of question, right? Because means is asking, what's the best way to do something in order to get what I want? A question about ends is well, what do I actually want? What should I want? What is wantable? What is desirable? What is, another way of putting this is what is good? Well, that's a different sort of thing, right? Do you have spiders that are thinking, you know what? Should I actually be eating other spiders? Does that make sense? Is it best for me as a spider to eat other spiders? Well, we don't have any empirical evidence of that happening. Animals, again, tend to sort of take it for granted that their goals are fixed, their ends are fixed, and then what they're thinking about is means. But we as human beings appear to have that question. What am I? Seriously, what am I? And what am I supposed to be doing? One way to see this is that if you take a squirrel, for example, and you drop off that squirrel in where I grew up in Oregon, and then you get another squirrel and you go around the globe, but you stay on the same longitude all the way around to another part of the world, and you find the same elevation, so that it's basically the same environment, basically the same in terms of it's the physical environment. Well, you're not going to see too much behavioral difference between this squirrel and this squirrel, right? They're going to act basically the same, because the environment, if you can control for environment, they're just going to be squirrels. What happens when you have a human community? Even before there was so much interaction between different communities, before the advent of modern transportation, you have a human community develop here and a human community develop here, and they're both in the same climate, they're both the same elevation, all that stuff. What do you get? You're going to get a lot of similarities, but you also get a lot of dissimilarities. In other words, you get what? Culture. Culture. You ever see animal cultures when you control for the natural environment? Certainly not in the same way that you see human cultures, which points to this question that, like, we're always asking about not only what's the best way to get what we want, but also what is it to want, right? All of that matters at the anthropological level, and we have to figure it out. Because again, if we don't figure that out, we're not going to figure this out. We're not going to figure out, etc. All right, 2 more rungs, and then we'll end part 1 of this lecture. In order to ask and answer this question, what is a human? We have to ask and answer a more basic question, which I'm running out of space here, but we'll call it ontological. This will be on your handout too, so if the writing's hard to read, you'll have it on your handout. Ontological. The ontological question is this: what is the nature of existence, or nature? What is the nature of existence or nature? Now, again, the first question to ask is, well, why do we have to ask and answer that question in order to ask and answer what is a human? The answer, the immediate answer is because humans aren't sui generis, when that way means like we don't pop out of ourselves, we exist within an existence, and of course we're dependent upon that existence in the most obvious ways. For example, like we don't generate our own oxygen, we don't generate our own we don't generate gravity, right? We don't we can have some control over nature, we don't have absolute control over nature, and so we are embedded in a greater structure of reality, which includes ultimately the entire cosmos and any multiverses, if in fact they actually exist. So we need to recognize not only that that's there, but we need to get a sense of, well, what is it like? What is it really? And for the sake of argument, there's basically two possibilities here. This is greatly simplifying it, but it's still accurate. Either one, there's meaning and purpose to reality. There's meaning, order, and structure and purpose to reality that's real, it's there. It's something that we can discover. Or all of reality is arbitrary, meaning there's no meaning and purpose. Now, we may try and interpret meaning and purpose as we interact with reality, but if in fact there is no meaning and purpose to reality, then our interpretations are false, they're delusional. They're like psychological crutches that we may use. So at this level here, the ontological level, we have to say, is there meaning and purpose to reality? Like really, are there really laws that are based in some kind of existential or a form of existence that transcends just individual existence of things? Is reality going somewhere? Is it intended in any way or not? Well, again, we have to figure that out at some level, because depending on how we answer that question, let's say, at the ontological level, and ontology just means, sorry, I should have said this before, it means the study of ontos, or being or existence. Another word we could use for it is metaphysics. If our metaphysical conclusion is that there's no such thing as meaning and purpose in the universe, it's arbitrary, it's chance, then out of that, you're not going to squeeze a humanity, you're not going to squeeze a human nature that all of a sudden gets to say, well, except for us, we're the one exception of the universe where there actually really is meaning and purpose. Because if existence itself is arbitrary, then any piece of existence within it is also going to be what? Yeah, arbitrary. So we need to recognize that. On the other hand, if we want to say that there is meaning and purpose that is real, the ontological level, well, then you're going to get a very different definition of humanity, right? A definition of everything in existence, that there is a meaning and purpose and potentially an intentionality. So we have to ask and answer that question. Now, one more. In order to ask and answer the ontological question, we have to go to the very tip top of our conceptual hierarchy, or the very bottom if we're doing the 3D model, and ask what's called a theological question. And I know I'm almost out of space. I'm actually totally out of space, but again, you'll have the handout. Theological question is basically this: what is the nature of ultimate existence? What is the nature of ultimate existence? Now, why do we have to answer that question? Because no matter what question we come up with at this what answer we come up with at the ontological level, like this is the way that reality is. We have to give an account of how is that possible? Where did it come from? Now, this is not meant to be a proof for the existence of God. It can be a helpful tool for that potentially, but this in and of itself is not meant to say that this demonstrates that God must exist. But it does demonstrate this: the question of God necessarily exists. Like we can't avoid that question, and we can't avoid answering it. Why? Because in order to, let's run through from the inside out now. In order to determine how I live right here and right now, like the decision I'm going to make right here in this very moment, the good thing for me to do right now, I have to have a theory of what's good and bad and right and wrong, and how to apply it. In order to have that theory of what's good and bad and right and wrong, I have to have a theory of how I know what I know, and believe in that, and believe that it's actually true, that it gives me access to something that I first and foremost believe is true. But in order to have a theory of how I know what I really know, I have to have a theory of the true definition of what human nature is, and why, and answer the question of, in terms of, do we think about just means, or we also think about ends? Am I fundamentally peaceful? Am I fundamentally conflictual? All that. I have to have an answer to that. In order to ask what is a human being, I have to ask and answer the question at the ontological level, well, what is being? How is it possible for a being so defined that I just described at the human level to exist at all within the cosmos, within the structure of reality writ large? And in order to ask and answer that question, you have to ask and answer the question, how is any of it at all possible? And where did it come from? Now, maybe your answer will be, it's all random, it's all arbitrary. Maybe it's all an illusion or something like that. And say it's just pure chance that everything is. We'll test that as we move out through the semester. But you see, you still, even someone who claims they're an absolute atheist still has to answer the question, does God exist? Like, the question itself is not avoidable. And the necessity of the question and the hierarchical relationship of the question in terms of it being at the bottom or at the very outer spirit, that seems to be unavoidable. In other words, we can't avoid the question of God. And how we answer that question, whether it's with a 0 or with a 1, and then if it's a 1, like what's the specific character of that 1, well, it's going to not only influence, but determine the output at every other level here. So for the end of part 1 of this lecture, this is the takeaway. We can't do ethics in the specific sense. We can't do applied ethics. We can't live our lives without in some way or another doing theology writ large. So as we move throughout the course, I always want this map operating. Think of it as a tool. So what you want to do is to say, well, why? Keep pushing beyond the particular claim to its higher conceptual level. Then ultimately what I want you to do as you're putting together your own arguments for yourself is I want you to give answers for yourself, not only to each rung here, but in a coherent way. Where, for example, it would be incoherent to say, for example, at the anthropological level, that human beings are basically just beasts and motivated by violence purely, just like the worst definition of nature we can come up with, and then to squeeze out of that some sort of ethic of kindness and compassion, right? You're gonna see a disconnect there, and then to push that and say, well, I'm going to treat everybody with kindness and respect, even though I believe human beings are fundamentally wicked creatures who are only intent on devouring each other. Disconnect, right? One doesn't lead to the other. So what I want you to do is not only answer each one of these questions, but put it all together in such a way that it's coherent. So what we're going to do in the second video is we're going to show how we can use this as a map, starting from the outside in and then moving out, and then I'll apply it to some of the readings. But I already want you to begin thinking about this for your papers and for the rest of the course. And I hope throughout the rest of your college career and life, how do I organize the structure of my own thought world in such a way that not only does it correspond with reality, but also and consequently, it's true. It's actually internally coherent and corresponds with reality as to the best of your lights. And again, it has to be your lights. Even if you end up agreeing with another person, which is fine, or agreeing with another body of beliefs, of course that's fine, that you have your own understanding of why you agree with it and why you think it's true. So, to be continued. I'll see you all again soon.